Again, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's TCDD Disability Policy Academy. The title of this presentation is Plugging the School to Prison Pipeline for Students with Developmental Disabilities. My name is Laura Marquez. I am the Developmental Disabilities Policy Fellow, a TCDD funded project out of the Paso del Norte Children's Development Center in El Paso. I will be your moderator for today's event. Before we get started with the program, I want to just first address a few of this Zoom housekeeping notes. Closed captioning for this event is being provided. So if you feel like you need to utilize those services, go ahead and click down below your screen on the CC button, and you'll be able to use that feature. Attendees that are present in muted and view only mode. The chat function is still available for attendees to pose questions or interactions with the panelists. But we do, however, encourage you to use the Q&A function for any questions specifically pertaining to the conversation and the programming that we have going on today. Finally, this segment will be an introduction segment. We'll have a discussion with Jean, our featured state legislator, and then we'll go on to a panel discussion. Between each segment, we'll have a Q&A. So again, please be mindful of the questions that you might want to ask of our featured speakers. And finally, this event is being recorded. So for those of you who are first-time attendees to the Disability Policy Academies or maybe new to TCDD, the Texas Council for Developmental Disabilities is a statewide board whose sole purpose is to address the needs and interests of individuals with developmental disabilities and their families. As part of the council's federal mandate, 60% of the 27 governor-appointed board members are individuals who have an intellectual or developmental disability or the family members. The council is driven by the mission to effect change so that people with disabilities experience full inclusion in their communities and exercise control over their lives. One of the many ways in which TCDD leads initiatives to improve the lives of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities is to fund programs and projects that align with their mission. So as a DD policy fellow at PD and Children's, I am very fortunate to have support from TCDD to pursue professional development in the area of disability policy, while also bolstering representation from the border region. Another way that TCDD informs and engages self-advocates and stakeholders on issues that impact individuals with IDD is through their disability policy academies, which you are attending today. These feature presentations from state and national experts on IDD issues. Academies provide policy professionals and stakeholders with an opportunity to take a deep dive into a specific issue or topic related to IDD by providing an overview on an issue and discussing what gaps exist and further determining any recommendations to address those gaps. They also provide overviews of the process to actually impact public policy. Previous academies held by TCDD have covered topics such as employment, residential options, sexual assault, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the IDD community, and advocacy during the current legislative session. TCDD expects to continue hosting these disability policy academies and conversations throughout the year. So for today's program, it was important that we put a spotlight on an issue that has long impacted students with disabilities, especially those who are at the intersection of race, ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation. The school to prison pipeline is defined as the policies and practices that result in students being funneled from the classroom into the juvenile and criminal justice system. Whether you are new to this term or not, I want to share a few bits of data for you to keep in mind as we hear from our experts today. Data from a 2015 report by the National Council on Disability show that even though children with disabilities make up only 12% of the K-12 student population, They make up 31% of students involved in school-related arrests, 58% of students subjected to involuntary seclusion during school hours, and 75% of students subjected to physical restraint during school hours. And on top of this, they are 2 times more likely to receive out-of-school suspension. These numbers only get worse when you factor in race, ethnicity, and gender identity or sexual orientation. Students with disabilities are facing a crisis in the education system. The criminalization of disability has created a reality where now an estimated 85% of youth who are incarcerated in juvenile correction facilities have an intellectual or developmental disability. This is, I'm sure you would agree, very atrocious, to say the least. Clearly, this is an urgent matter, and that's why we wanted to hear from the folks who are on the front lines using policy advocacy to plug the school to prison pipeline once and for all. So with that, I'll go ahead and kick off the program. I'm so pleased and honored to introduce our first speaker, Representative Jean Wu. The state representative, Jean Wu, proudly serves the people of District 137 in the Texas House. Prior to being elected in 2012, he served as a prosecutor in the Harris County District Attorney's Office, where he sought justice for thousands of crime victims. Jean is currently an attorney in private practice. Since being elected state representative, Jean has maintained a focus on juvenile justice, specifically fighting the school to prison pipeline and passing a comprehensive CPS reform bill in the 85th legislative session. Jean has also been appointed to the Texas Access to Justice Commission, Texas State Child Fatality Review Team. Now, in his current term, Jean has been appointed to serve on the Article 3 Subcommittee in the House Appropriations Committee and the Juvenile Justice and Family Issues Committee, where he will focus on reforming current criminal justice policies to reflect the needs of his constituents and Texans across the state. Outside of his legislative work, Jean remains active and involved in the Houston community. He currently serves on community advocacy organization boards, such as the OCA Greater Houston Advisory Board, the Chinese Community Center Advisory Board, and the Baker Ripley Neighborhood Centers Advisory Committee. As an attorney, Jean serves as a guardian ad litem in which he represents children in either criminal or CPS cases. Additionally, Jean is passionate in supporting young people in becoming active in civic roles and has attended multiple youth-led rallies across his home and in the city of Houston. Jean grew up in Southwest Houston neighborhood of Sharpstown. He earned his Bachelor's degree of Science degree from Texas A&M University, a master's degree from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and a law degree from the South Texas College of Law in Houston. Jean and his wife, Maya, reside in Southwest Houston and are proud parents of 2 sons, Winston and Lyndon. Welcome, very, very much welcome, Jean, and you know, we're so thankful for you to be here with us today. I want to be mindful of your time, but if you want to start off with a few words and we can get into the conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's a reminder for me to shorten my bio. That is way too long. But I'm very happy to be here. You know, part of the reason why I do a lot of the things I do is my day job is I represent kids in both the CPS system and in the juvenile delinquency system. So, you know, when we talk about kids with intellectual disabilities being forced into a school to prison pipeline, that's really what I do on a daily basis as my day job. Many of my kids, I represent mostly do high-level felonies. Most of my kids charged with very serious crimes. Almost all of them fall into the range of disability. I have many kids who in their assessment fall into the about 75, 85 IQ range, have multiple mental health issues, and have suffered pretty severe trauma throughout their life. Many of them have watched very extreme violence in their life happen to their loved ones. Many of them have been sexually abused, sexually exploited. Many of them are food insecure, and just any host of things that we would not wish upon our worst enemies. And we have students, we have children who suffer from this on a daily basis. But yet, when they get in trouble, when they have problems at school, we don't provide them the understanding and the services that they truly need. And this is something that I think is frankly immoral for a society that calls themselves a Christian society, that we believe that people should be treated with kindness and with fairness. We don't do that. And we don't do it, especially for kids and even adults with intellectual disabilities. And unfortunately, because the community itself is often unable to advocate for itself, that this problem is often ignored. When we talk about the budget, these line items get pushed to the wayside and they don't get the attention they deserve. I'm trying to make a small dent in that, but it's going to take our whole society to make this change and to prioritize individuals and kids and adults who have special needs. And I'm very happy to be here, and I see a lot of my friends here, and I'm very proud to work with them and continue the fight to make sure that we have justice for everyone, not just people who are able, but people who are differently abled as well.
Absolutely. Justice for all is very important. And one of the first things I was going to ask is what brought you to this work? And you've, just as you've shared right now, this isn't just an issue that you chose to focus on. You're living this issue in your daily work every day, not just as a legislator, but in your work as a citizen. And so in just looking at your extensive background and what you've already done in the legislature since you've been in office, I was going over through some of your bills, and in particular, and related to school prison pipeline, I was piqued by HB 1201 that you have related to alternative settings for behavior management and this aspect of restorative discipline. That's something you can talk to us a little about?
Sure.
A little bit.
Actually, I have several bills, but if you will pardon me, I don't remember the numbers. Like after my third session was like time when I can't remember bill numbers anymore because it all just sort of like runs together. In fact, like there's times that people will say, "Oh, hey, we thank you for passing this bill," and I'm like, "Did I? I don't remember. I'm sorry." But so we have actually several bills, and the first bill you're talking about is what we very quietly call the Restorative Justice Bill. And this is a bill to get schools to stop using more aggressive forms of segregation and segregation type of discipline in dealing with kids. One of my big pet peeves is that schools no longer do the job that they are paid to do, and that is educate. Like, when I was a kid, when you got in trouble, you got sent to the principal's office, and I did get in trouble, by the way. And you got a talking to people, and people sat down with you and say, "Hey, why did you do this? What happened? What did you learn from this? How can you fix this in the future? How should you have reacted differently?" And then there was a teaching moment. And hopefully you learn to be a better person. And that's what schools are supposed to do. But instead, when schools now, because of the stresses within schools, what they end up doing is they end up finding ways to get rid of kids, that are problems so that they don't have to deal with them. And sometimes that means arrest, that the kids are being arrested nowadays. And for things that, in my days, you would have just got sent to the principal's office and they would have dealt with you. But the other way is getting kids suspended, getting kids expelled. And what we're trying to do is saying like, hey, before you take those measures, before you expel a kid, before you suspend the kid, put the kid in JJEP or a DAEP, whatever it is, those are harsh penalties that don't necessarily help that child learn. Let's figure out a way, can we do some type of resolution that doesn't have them becoming a black sheep for the school, right? If you segregate a kid and you throw them away into a hole, that's not really good for, that's not really good trauma-informed care. That's not really good education. And we're trying to get schools to like, just think about what you're doing. Stop doing more harm to a child than is necessary, right? We have another bill that that deals with school arrest. One of the big problems that we're having is there is a wide gulf in the way schools are treating kids, and this is of course exacerbated by kids with mental health issues, kids with intellectual disability, kids of different races, and different school districts have different policies and treat kids differently. And we have some school districts that are very aggressive in having children arrested on their campuses. And so we have a bill to make schools report who is being arrested. Do they, what's their race? What is their special needs? What is their disability? And we want to have a list. We want to know if there are schools that have a disproportionately high number of kids who are disabled being arrested. We can't address problems if we don't know what the problems are. So that's another point. In terms of intellectual disability, I have one more bill. Don't ask me the number. I have another bill that tries to equalize the treatment of kids with disabilities, kids with intellectual disability with kids who have mental health issues. So in Chapter 55 of the Family Code, it deals with court procedures. And right now in the law, if you have a child who is unable to proceed in court because of mental health issues, they have options to do inpatient treatment or outpatient treatments, and so they don't have to be sent to a state hospital. But the law basically says that a child, if they can't proceed in court because of intellectual disability, must be sent to a state hospital. And that is a brutal response, and it seems like a very unfair response for no apparent reason, other than we missed it when we were drafting this stuff. So I have a bill to equalize it, to give both sides the ability to ask for either inpatient or outpatient treatment, and that seems only fair. I've got a bunch of other bills, but those are probably the key ones.
No, and absolutely, thank you for that information. Both very, very important issues that need to be addressed. And like you said, sometimes, especially with the bill you just mentioned, some unintended consequences happen for other groups. So kind of adding that equalization, as you said, is very important, and appreciate absolutely trying to set that in motion. So now that you've kind of given us a background of some of the bills that are your priority in this area related to the IDD community, for this current session, what would you say is the legislative outlook for addressing the pipeline, through these bills, that, you think, are there going to be specific barriers that you are foreseeing? We know that this session is unlike any other.
So one, it's kind of too early to tell. And two, support for the IDD community is not going to come from laws. The real thing you're going to be looking for is the budget, right? Policy means nothing without funding. And this is why I've stayed on the Appropriations Committee for 3 sessions now. And this is where I intend to stay, because addressing the state's budget is more important than anything else. Because right now, I'm sure all of you guys know that there is about a 125,000 applicant backlog in the disability assistance services. Harris County, or HISD, is under review for their handling of special education. The state as a whole, even though we pass a law that says that TEA cannot discriminate against children who have learning disabilities, that's fine. We passed a law saying they can't do it, but we didn't put in the money for them to fix it, right? We put in some money, but not all of it. So at the end of the day, what you're really looking for is, what do the budgetary priorities look like to help differently abled communities? And that's really, I mean, almost absent of anything else, that's the real question. Because if schools have the money and the resources to properly deal with a child who's intellectually disabled, and instead of finding easier but more harsh methods of dealing with them, they will. But administrators almost always default to the thing that costs the least money, and takes the least amount of resources, because that's just the nature of things, and that's just what human beings do. So in terms of the budget, the House side looks very good. It was and we're waiting for the Senate budget to come over. Public education spending is not going to be reduced from what we put in 2019. So the HB3 additions, there's additional money for special education. There's additional support for it for school districts. All that is in place. Now, we were looking to increase that amount of money prior to 2020, and everything sort of like going belly up. But right now, public education, for the most part, especially primary education, is being fully funded at the cost of many other agencies. So, most agencies, the vast majority of agencies across the state, took a 5% cut. Education did not. Public education did not. Most of the agencies have requested the restoration of the 5% cuts. Most of the vast majority of them will not get it, in order to make sure that public education is fully funded from what we had it last time. Okay, so that's good. Bad part is we don't have extra money to keep fixing the problems that we were trying to fix last time. So it's sort of like, things are not bad, but things are not necessarily getting better, if that makes sense. And again, these are my opinions. You can talk to someone else who may say, I think things are great. But my expectations for what we're doing for special needs kids, we were so low. The bar was set so low previously that, for a lot of people, any raising of it is fantastic. But I'm saying, like, look, you raise it 3 inches off the floor, it's still only 3 inches off the floor. It's better than being on the floor, but it's still real low. And I think we can do better. So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
No, it absolutely is. And actually, I mean, you're hitting everything, every point. And especially, I wanted to ask you something specific to your role on the Article 3 subcommittee for House Appropriations. And
Yep.
And you're exactly right. I'm no expert in this area, but from what I've heard from experts and colleagues that I speak to, the budget is very important, and getting budget writers in to kind of address these situations is very important.
Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you my current fight. So what was told to us was, after the base budget is what, like, the staff and the LBB and basically the chairs have come up with, the House side plus the Senate side. And this is what we agree is the base budget, the very bottom line. And we can add to it, we can subtract from it, but we were told that there was not any money to play with after the base budget. But my big fight right now is I only had one. I mean, literally, there's 1,000 different requests in education, because we have public education, we have higher education. Every single university has like 6 or 7 requests, and they have the community colleges, and everyone has those have 6 or 7 requests. But I focus down on, and most members say, like, hey, you get a couple of chips. What do you put your chips on? And my fight right now is about the Wyndham schools. The Wyndham School District is the prison school district, right? It is the school district that serves adult prisoners in TDCJ. And unlike public schools, they took a 5% cut. But a 5% cut for them means that 10,000 prisoners don't get an education. And now, while we may say, well, what's 10,000 people? Well, 10,000 people may not be a lot, but when we talk about these are people that we need them to get an education while they're in prison because they were not properly served when they were students, when they were young, because maybe they did have intellectual disabilities, maybe they had mental health issues, maybe they had any number of issues that kept them from getting an education. If we can help them get an education while they are in prison, and then when they leave prison, they have some life skills, they have some ability to cope, and they have some hope for the future, that could mean a big difference in whether or not they will come back into the prison system. And this is my fight right now. And I say, like, look, it's $5 million to make sure that over more than 10,000 prisoners a year get at least a partial education. So when they leave the prison system, that there is some hope for them. I think that's really valuable, and that's my bright line right now. And it's going to be tough going. I mean, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And all excellent points that you're sharing with us today. I really appreciate the time that you're sharing to enlighten us on a lot of this. I want to be sure that we're aware of your time and also the time that we address for some Q&A from the audience. I have been seeing some questions pop in, and Scott at TCDD is going to hop on, I believe, and help me filter through some of these questions. Did you find any specific?
Yes, thanks for sticking around for a Q&A, Representative Wu. So we have, I'll start off with one comment that was made by Linda Litzinger. She's heard that if you were sent to a state hospital, there was a minimum number of 3 weeks for your stay, no matter if the need is solved more quickly. She thinks it's really tough for a child with a disability, so thank you for proposing outpatient care instead. So kudos for your bill. We have a question from Curtistine White, who asks, what can organizations that serve this population do to encourage lawmakers to increase budget support for these policy issues?
As with any public policy issue, the first part is education. I will tell you, I don't want to sugarcoat anything. Politicians, when you go to them, they're always very much, oh, absolutely, we'll support you. Fantastic. Now get the hell out of my office, right? They're going to tell you whatever you want to hear. But I think it's important to actually sit down with them and educate them and say, look, I know you publicly have said you care about kids and adults with IDD, but here's what that means in real life. Here's are the struggles. Here are the actual struggles that that kids with IDD deal with in the TEA system and under TEA rules. And then not only that, but provide an actual solution. And this is what I tell every single group that wants to come to the legislature. Don't just, if you complain, you need to have a solution. Don't complain if you don't have a way to fix it. And this is really super important because you need lawmakers to have something to latch onto. And you say like, and don't just come in and say, like, oh, we just need more money. Like, more money for what? The budget, the budget paperwork is like, several feet thick. What do you want it in? And have a specific ask and say, like, we're only asking for $10 million in this strategy. And that's all we want. And this will take care of an additional 40,000 students. And make a very specific ask to solve a specific problem and do that one piece at a time. If you go in and say, I want you to care about kids with IDD, every politician go, fantastic, I care. And then they do nothing, right? So don't just ask people to be supportive of kids. Ask them and give a very specific request of them.
Excellent, thank you. And so Miranda Merritt asks a fairly substantial question in relation to the bill that you were talking about with the equity between mental health and ID. And I think it kind of boils down to, so you say that the law is set up to send individuals with IDD to a state hospital if they cannot stand trial, but many state hospitals don't have proper training and tools to address mental health and trauma issues for individuals with IDD. So how do we address these gaps in mental health services for individuals with IDD in the community and in the schools?
Yeah. So there's not state hospital plural. There is one. It's Mejia, and there is almost a 2-year backlog in admissions for IDD. Frankly, I don't want to build more state hospitals for IDD. I don't think being sent to essentially let's just call it a prison, because you're locked up in there. You're not free to come and go as you please. If you're not free to come and go as you please, that's a prison. So I don't want more kids being sent to a facility where they're locked up because of their intellectual disability. I want them to be treated at home. I want them to be treated in the community. And I think the way we work about that is talk to your counties. That's the real strategy. Part of the reasons why a lot of times kids get sent to state prisons, state hospitals, because the counties don't want to deal with it. They don't want to pay for it. They don't have the resources. They don't have the programs. Talk to your county, get them to say, like, let's start looking at services. Let's start looking at ways that we can help our juvenile probation department deal with kids with intellectual disability without sending them off.
Excellent. And I think we have time for just one more question, if you don't mind. And the question is, are low-income parents provided pro bono legal assistance when their IDD son or daughter have committed a crime within the school system?
It depends what you mean. So do the schools provide counsel? No, absolutely not. And that's another whole, like, I have like another 30-minute rant about that. But in terms of if they get arrested, if they get arrested and they're in court, then court is required by law to provide that. Now, the child gets an attorney, the parents do not. So children charged with criminal acts are treated the same under the Constitution as adults. So they're required there's a requirement for a presumption of innocence. They have a right to remain silent, and they have a right to counsel. And it's good. So the court systems are run well. It's where we run into the schools that's a real issue. So a lot of the school decisions, they're not really appealable. It's whatever they say. They don't have to support their decisions by actual evidence. And this is a constant struggle for families with special needs kids, because if you have a school district that just says, like, we'll do whatever we feel like, and we don't follow our rule, we don't follow any rules, and there's nothing a parent can do. And most parents don't even have they don't have the resources and the understanding to even fight it in the first place. I would love for there to be counsel provided. It's realistically, it's not going to happen.
All right, thank you. And we did get a number of other questions. I'll try and do a follow-up with some of these if we can answer them as a follow-up to registrants. But thank you for taking the time, Representative Wu.
Absolutely. And apologize, I got to run. I got another interview right now. So.
No, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and just dive right into our next panel conversation. So continuing with this discussion, I'll go ahead and just start by introducing our wonderful panel of speakers. And I'll go ahead and ask you all to turn on your cameras at this moment. So I'll start with Andrew, since you turned your camera on first. Andrew Reginald Hairston, he/they, is a civil rights attorney and writer based in Austin, Texas, though also in Oklahoma City in time of the coronavirus pandemic. He is presently the Education Justice Project Director at Texas Appleseed. He earned his law degree from Louisiana State University in May 2016, where he was a faculty scholar, and he received his bachelor's degree cum laude from Howard University. From 2017 to 2019, Andrew served as a staff attorney at the Advancement Project, a multiracial civil rights organization in Washington, D.C. He began his legal career as the George N. Lindsay Fellow and Associate Counsel at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law from 2016 to 2017. And he is licensed to practice law in Louisiana. Next, we have Malhar Shah from Los Angeles, and he is a child of Indian immigrants from Mumbai, India. He studied gender and sexuality studies at the University of California, Riverside, and graduated from Harvard Law School. After law school, Malhar returned to his home in Los Angeles to become a litigation fellow for the Opportunity Law Project, where he advocated for students' rights to basic literacy education and trauma-sensitive education services. He currently works at the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund on issues of disabled students' access to quality educational services and freedom from abusive and traumatic restraints and seclusions. And finally, we have Angel Crawford, attorney at law. She received her Bachelor's of Arts in Sociology and Political Science from St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas in 2009. During which time she spent a semester working in DC in international conflict resolution at American University. In 2002, Angel received her Juris Doctorate with a specialization in litigation from Marquez University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and was inducted into the Pro Bono Society for her service helping indigent individuals with a variety of legal matters. As an attorney on the education team at Disability Rights Texas, the protection and advocacy organization in our state, Angel serves the El Paso and West Texas region. In addition to representing students and parents in special education related matters, she also does bilingual educational outreach for the rural areas throughout the region to educate students, families, and professionals, and the community at large on the law and rights related to special education. Prior to joining Disability Rights Texas, Angel worked in private practice representing individuals with disabilities in Social Security, disability, and personal injury matters. So, as you can hear from those amazing bios, you just heard that we have grouped an amazing panel to help us dive deeper into this issue of the school to prison pipeline. We want to hear, of course, we heard from Representative Wu from our Texas legislative perspective, and now we want to hear from advocates on the ground doing the work. I know we have a lot to cover, and there's really no way that we could do this topic justice in this amount of time, but we're going to do our best. So with that, I'll go ahead and jump right in. First, for each of you, I want to give you a little chance to talk about your respective organizations' initiatives that are specifically directed at dismantling the school to prison pipeline and protecting civil rights for students. And I'll go ahead and start off with Andrew.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura, and for this opportunity to join this esteemed panel. So Texas Appleseed is a public interest justice center based in Austin that we work across the state of Texas. We're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. We started in 1996, and we're loosely affiliated with the Appleseed Network. There are 16 Appleseed centers, including us in the United States and one in Mexico City. And Texas Appleseed has a broad mission to attack unjust laws and policies that unduly burden historically underserved people across Texas. So through that broad mission, we've been able to really hone in on our programmatic priorities over the past 25 years. And in addition to fighting the school to prison pipeline, do work in fair financial services access, fair housing relief and disaster relief, and criminal justice reform, among other issues. So for us, the school to prison pipeline really came on our radar probably around 15 years ago. My boss, who's the current executive director, came on as a staff attorney in 2005 and really ushered in this era of the organization where folks were really thinking about how exclusionary discipline was operating to push so many young people out of their classrooms. And under her leadership, really, I think, ushered in some groundbreaking reports on exclusionary discipline, suspensions, and expulsions, and really helped advocates across the state of Texas and across the country think about ways to interact with local and state policymakers to advance changes that would chip away at the school to prison pipeline. I think over the past few years, we've been very much more thoughtful about how the presence of school police just harms so many young people. And in these conversations that we're having in our society, after the year that we've had with the pandemic and the uprisings against racist police violence, we're at this point now where we're saying police don't have a place in schools, and we are trying to support local and statewide efforts to make that a reality for young Texans, the call for police-free schools. So that's kind of where we are in our education justice work at Texas Appleseed.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Malhar, would you like to speak a little bit about DREDF and DREDF? How do you all say it? How your work at DREDF?
Yeah, we call it DREDF. It is a long name, but I appreciate being invited to be on this panel. DREDF, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, has been around for over 40 years in the Bay Area, specifically Berkeley, California, which many folks consider to be one of the key places that disability rights and advocacy began in the United States. A lot of the great folks who have worked here at DREDF before me were really key to the creation and passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the ADA, the Rehabilitation Act, have been key in ensuring that those statutes are properly interpreted through regulations and then properly enforced through class actions and litigation and on-the-ground efforts. We also run a parent training and information center at this organization, which is a center that is funded under the IDEA. It funds non-attorney advocates who assist parents in advocating for their own children, in creating the advocacy tools that they need for their students with disabilities. It's really a great organization, and so much of our work really every single day crosses over with the school to prison pipeline. Most of my caseload around education law and special education law consists of representing students of color, low-income students of color, usually in spatially segregated cities and neighborhoods where their schools either lack the resources or the proper oversight to ensure that students of color are provided the proper services, and where the presence of law enforcement, of police, of security officers in that school is so prevalent that those students live in constant fear, go to school in constant fear, and are traumatized daily by their interactions with school police officers or simply the presence of school police officers. So much of our work really crosses over with racial and gender advocacy and racial and gender justice really every day. And what we see is that the failure to provide services and supports to students with disabilities obviously is going to disproportionately impact low-income students of color the most.
Thank you so much. Angel, would you like to speak a little bit about some initiatives at DRTX?
Hey, absolutely. So Disability Rights Texas, again, we're the protection advocacy agency for the state of Texas. A lot of our work is, of course, representing and assisting individuals with disabilities throughout their stages of life. Our education team is really where we're looking at that school to prison pipeline and trying to advocate and work with parents, students to assure that appropriate services and supports are being provided to students to receive that free, appropriate public education. So a lot of our work is doing, getting individuals the assistance they need through the child find obligations that schools have, updating the IEPs to assure the services and supports are adequately addressing the students' needs as they grow, as they develop. We work on different topics. Most relevant to today's topic is the juvenile justice. So we have a program through the Juvenile Probation Education Advocacy Program that's addressing issues with individuals who are involved in the juvenile justice system. Much of the work being done with that, and we're trying to expand it, of course, throughout the state to work with different groups. But right now with the Harris County, they've provided, a lot of training, technical assistance to the staff members, how to request special education evaluations, how to get involved, how to determine whether special education services may be appropriate, and advocating in that way. Any training that we do, we always include the protections under the IDEA law, and regard to the school discipline, educating on child find. We advocate directly with school districts to remove or at least reduce school resource officers, reducing the utilization of school district police departments, wanting more funding to go into that support of social workers and counselors and mental health professionals to address the needs of the students, as opposed to relying on the police departments, the resource officers, as being the go-to for behavioral issues that in most cases really should be addressed on a non-legal standpoint, right? We shouldn't be arresting students. We shouldn't be disciplining disability. So much of our work is finding out what's going on, trying to take action. In addition to the reduction of arrests, we're trying to do everything we can to reduce restraints, unlawful restraints, causing further trauma to these students that then kind of escalate the whole situation to being worse. Once we start with the restraints, once we start arresting, the students lose that safe feeling that they should have at school, and therefore can cause further trauma to lead to further behaviors. And it's just an unfortunate cycle. So much of our work is providing that training, advocating, going to meetings, talking to the professionals, and working with school districts to really be focused on the students' development, positive behavioral supports, going positive, as opposed to just constantly focusing on, again, getting students out of the campus by suspension, by expulsion, but instead focusing on providing those supports in school, providing that support to the students.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, all of you. Clearly very important work. I wanted to hit back with Andrew real quick. And through the education justice project that you have, I've seen that you've done some work with ISDs across the state. And I even saw that with EPISD, one of the largest school districts in the state that's here in El Paso, you're trying to get to this initiative of the over-policing that's going on in schools and instill this restorative justice practices, with education justice, and trauma-informed practices. So how are you getting this message across and this work done?
Yeah, appreciate Angel and Malhar speaking to how ubiquitous this is across the country, how Black and Brown children, kids with disabilities, LGBTQ young people across the country can expect to be over-policed so often. And as Representative Wu said, it's really just amoral, right? So I think that the year that we have lived through from March 2020 to March 2021 has set the stage for some really radical opportunities, right? The coronavirus pandemic and the federal government's complete abdication of its duty to support folks within the borders of the United States, radicalized folks, George Floyd's murder, Breonna Taylor's, Tony McDade's murder, so many other folks who have died at the hands of the police, push folks to hit the streets this past summer in ways that have not been seen in American history. And folks are still sitting with that incredible momentum of how do we continue to devote the energy that we have felt during this time of radicalization where folks are saying that a better world is possible for folks, right? And it can start with the youngest among us, the most vulnerable among us. So, you know, a lot of our advocacy after the George Floyd murder looked like reaching out with a coalition of ours based in Harris County, a few other grassroots organizations like Disability Rights Texas and Children's Defense Fund of Texas, to name a couple of, wrote letters to Austin ISD, San Antonio ISD, Houston ISD, and Dallas ISD to say, this is the time to divest from school policing, right? I know there are broader conversations around defund the police and how folks about that, but we have illustrated to you for so long the data and the anecdotal evidence from folks in communities that school policing leads to psychological and physical harm for young people and does not equate to school safety in any meaningful way. So even if you took a fraction of the budget, let's take Dallas ISD, for example, with a combined $24 million budget for policing and security apparatuses, perhaps for the 1920 school year. Even if you took $5 million of that money and devoted it to social emotional learning, to resources for more mental health professionals, psychologists, and counselors who can be employed by the district, and folks who can create this holistic learning environment for young people, you will start to see this ripple effect, right? And you know, it's one thing in our advocacy that we recognize that it's taken us decades and centuries to get to this moment. But if we start right now and really actualize these calls for Black Lives Matter and for racial and social justice in every way we can, this will lead to so many beneficial policy changes, right, that will impact generations of young people down the road. So to answer your question more succinctly, Laura, it's basically using this incredible momentum of the moment to say that, you know, folks are rightfully demanding for that better, more just world, especially for young people. And we're right there behind them in that call.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, Representative Wu touched on that at one of the last things he said is education. You know, you're capitalizing on this movement, as you said, and sort of what has come to a head, and educating all these districts on other ways to support students that are more effective and can help students at a grander level. So again, it's very important the work that you're doing. Malhar, I wanted to ask about DREDF. There was a policy, a publication that was put out related to DRED, specifically calling out how schools' inability to implement the IDEA, so the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, specifically in that realm, the inability to implement that act and protect students with disabilities, implement individualized education programs has resulted in what we're seeing of the practices of the school to prison pipeline. Can you speak a little bit more to that as far as your practice area?
Certainly, I can definitely do that. This is actually, in my opinion, one of the, I think next to restraints and seclusions, one of just the biggest, one of the biggest struggles for students with disabilities, and really tied to the school to prison pipeline and really the use of restraints and seclusions. What we see often is schools in segregated neighborhoods. I mean, doesn't necessarily have to be, but usually schools in segregated neighborhoods either lack the funding or the proper oversight to provide to one, identify students with disabilities, properly identify students with disabilities. Oftentimes what we'll see is that Black students, for example, are labeled with the emotional disturbance category under the IDEA, which is a very racialized category that often does not get to the root of their disabilities if they do have any. In addition to that, what we see is once those students are identified, if they even are identified with the proper disability category, are not then provided with robust special education services. Two examples that I can provide are the requirement for students whose disabilities cause behavior struggles and behavior problems. Two services that are required are a behavior intervention plan, which is a comprehensive document that provides the services and supports that school districts must provide to that student to help them manage their behaviors, to help them manage their emotions, to heal from past traumas, and a functional behavioral assessment, which really provides the data to create really good plans. Oftentimes, school districts will write really poor plans that actually reinforce negative behavior and increase interactions those students will have with restraints, with school police officers, for example. And even when a student doesn't have a disability that causes behavioral struggles, for example, a student with a dyslexia may not get the proper services and supports. And what we might see is a student who is in 8th grade reading at a 2nd grade level, a student in high school who in a previous case, not necessarily in the special education context, who I interacted with, who couldn't read a menu, a high school student who couldn't read a menu and was embarrassed because of it. One can only expect that the economic and social life outcomes for that person, because of the lack of services to help them gain essential literacy skills, things that just are very baseline for any person, are going to certainly steer that person into prison, into a life of unemployment, into an inability to provide for themselves and their families. So these are just some key aspects of how we see that occurring: misidentification, underidentification, and then the failure to provide really important services. And then the last thing I really quick want to add to what Andrew was saying is this is a really momentous time, as Andrew said, and we should really see it's a momentous time, because what we see is Black families who are at home right now are like, you know what, not being at school is great because now my kid isn't being arrested, now my kid isn't being abused, and that is so sad. That and what we see also is that those Black families are being underserviced at home, but they might prefer it to being at school where they're criminalized.
You know, I'm so glad you brought that up. In some of the research and the background that I was doing, I came across an article, a very recent article that was saying the pandemic has indeed kind of put a pause on the school to prison pipeline. You're seeing less referrals, you're seeing less instances because the students aren't in school to have these injustices inflicted on them on a daily basis. And to your point about, you know, the inadequacy in the implementation of the IDEA, when you're labeling students, especially students of color with emotional disturbance, you're creating a mistrust in the system that's supposed to potentially protect them and provide them the services. That's another barrier when you're trying to access the community and support a community in a certain way. So I'm really glad that you brought that topic up. In terms of the law, you know, Rep. Wu mentioned, yeah, we have a law for that. It doesn't mean that it's gonna get applied or that it's actually, you know, something that we're seeing being respected or implemented. Angel, your work as an attorney, you know full well that there are protections for students with disabilities in regard to discipline. Can you talk about some of the disintegration in some of those mechanisms that are put into, for instance, a manifestation determination, right? Put into the law to help protect the student. How has that deteriorated to such a way where we're still seeing so many students being funneled into the juvenile and criminal justice system?
Right. So one of the things I wanted to kind of mention, it's a lot of my cases pre-pandemic were actually dealing with, you know, inclusion and MDRs and doing all of these things. And I continued working on the cases to assure appropriate services and supports for these students. So many of the parents are now seeing, well, maybe being at home is better because they're not being arrested, they're not having these referrals, everything like that. And it's a fortunate thing, but it's unfortunate that the parents even have to see that is they're being able to see firsthand how their child is being treated, whether they're being ignored in virtual classrooms, whether they're being yelled at, whether they're being whatever. And now the parents are able to see what's going on. And so now they're advocating more, where so much of the information parents were receiving before was your child is a discipline problem. We have to give them consequences. We have to teach them a lesson, whatever the case may be, where it seems that the behavior intervention plans were ineffective. A functional behavioral assessment was not being done appropriately. Behavioral intervention plans became a laundry list of consequences that, you know, this is a bad behavior, therefore we're going to discipline it out of the child. Whereas the law is very clear that the behavioral intervention plan is intended to be a support for students whose behaviors are interfering with theirs or others' ability to receive education. There should be positive behavioral supports, an understanding of what is causing a behavior. It is not always a child acting out, but maybe a response to previous trauma. It may be an embarrassment. They're embarrassed to, you know, say that they can't read a lunch menu, so therefore they act out in the cafeteria. They do these things, whereas, so they're being disciplined for acting out in the cafeteria, whereas they need additional supports in their reading language arts, right? So we have to get these understandings. And the protections under the law are, as you mentioned, you know, the manifestation determination, you know, to determine if certain behaviors are a result of an individual student's disability, because it's important to recognize that disability should not be disciplined. We should not be disciplining a student because they have a disability. So it's important for us to understand that those manifestation determination reviews are intended to gain additional information, gain a better understanding for the students, what's going on, what is causing these behaviors, why is a student doing what the student is doing. Oftentimes we see that the manifestation determination reviews, there's this whole belief, you know, if a student is going to change placement for 10 or more days, whether they're consecutive or they're kind of spread out, then that's when the manifestation determination review is triggered, right? So, but what we're seeing is, you know, parents are being contacted to pick up their child early. They're asked to bring the child in late. And all of these, you know, should be counted as incidents of, okay, this is one day that the placement was changed because they were sent home. They're not being suspended, but the parents being asked to pick up their child because their behaviors are affecting something or other. All of these days very quickly add up to those 10 days, but they unfortunately haven't been triggering that requirement for the manifestation determination review, which requires a school to take action to figure out, you know, what's causing it, to do a functional behavioral assessment, to update the behavioral intervention plans. So we're kind of seeing a lot of that because there are protections for, again, students to receive that free appropriate public education. They have to be in school. They have to be receiving those academic supports. They have to be receiving that education. And not being sent home, not being, you know, removed from the classroom, whatever the case may be, because those result in being a change in placement. A lot of the protections that are in place, the school districts are just failing to identify the reasons for action or for behaviors. They're failing to identify that there's a disability that may need assistance. Instead, they're failing to utilize or, I guess, honor their child find requirements. So a lot of the protections are to identify if there's a disability, to assist the students in learning and growing, and always focusing on the positive behavior interventions. And recognizing behaviors, again, may not call for discipline, but maybe additional support in one area or another.
Thank you so much. Yeah, like you said, it's another factor of improper implementation of what's already outlined in IDEA. And so it's these disconnects that we have to find some way to remedy, and you all are doing that amazing work. Dr. Andrew, I wanted to kind of ask you this kind of, and please forgive if this is not a detailed enough question, but for the consequences, you know, we've talked about some of these at the individual level, the consequences for students that, you know, are, you know, experiencing these situations with the school to prison pipeline. What do you see as this grander thing, and you've touched on it a little, this societal consequence, this consequence as a whole, if this perpetuation of the pipeline continues, especially for, as you said, our marginalized communities, you know, students with disabilities and students of color?
So it continues the oppressive nature of the American project going on for 245 years, right? And for centuries on this land, the displacement and slaughter of indigenous people, the enslavement of Black people, right? The othering of so many folks that have led us to this moment where we are having this reckoning and living through an era of collapse, right? As strong of a statement as it is to say, right? But in that, we kind of understand through human history, through our lived experiences, that even as we face all of the consequences of these terrible systems, right? Capitalism, imperialism, all these forms of oppression, there are so many ways that folks have turned into one another in this moment through mutual aid support. I've been kind of skimming the chat, and folks are kind of asking what supports can be offered from school districts to young people in them with IDD. And you know, a foundational way that I'm viewing the world right now is through that lens of prison industrial complex abolition, right? To say that what is happening right now was happening in 1776 to so many folks, right? To Black folks, to folks with disabilities, to LGBTQ folks, right? And to break the will, we have to, in fact, do that, right? We have to say explicitly, these systems cannot be reformed. Prisons, policing, the way that they have infected our school environments for our young people, the will has to be broken, right? And these carceral logics just have to be removed from. It is a bold, radical statement to make. It is necessary for the moment, right? And if we don't address it in that way, as you have posed the question, Laura, we'll just continue to have these individual grievances and tragedies lead to broader societal failures, right? And not of the people themselves who are enduring it, but just of the consequences of these systems. So, you know, I think we have to be just very intentional about, you know, naming that principle of abolition in this moment, of saying that police don't need to be in schools, that we don't need to replace police in schools once we remove them, right? We have to, with the concept of prison industrial complex abolition, a foundational piece of it is the relationships that are built between humans, between communities, right? So we have to pour into those relationships as best as we can, kind of using those resources that we had built through the mutual aid that has gotten us through the pandemic, and say that as we continue to pour into this model of the world, this will lead to more opportunities for people to thrive, to live their lives over the 100 years that they'll be here, right, with fully invested communities, art access, education, healthcare, housing, right? All of it kind of comes together in the same vein. And so I think for all of us on this panel, right, we have recognized that for young people, the harms are the most pernicious. And this is where we start to get to abolition, to call for the end of these systems as they are really harming our babies. And from there, build up that new world that really should serve us all and can serve us all as we go through this tumultuous period. I know that was a lot, but hopefully it made sense.
No, and I was fortunate enough to watch one of your presentations yesterday from Texas Appleseed about education justice in this legislature. And I was impacted by so many of the things that were discussed yesterday. This is a long game. It's something that it's been a long time going. It's not something that can necessarily be reversed immediately, but the fight is there. And I know that I see so many familiar names and comments and people present on this call that are in that fight alongside you. And so with that, I want to kind of shift to conversations for all of y'all to go ahead and chime in from your perspective. But in talking about that, and you touched a little bit about this coalition building, working together and in community. What are some of your favorite resources, favorite tools, ways to get involved? Because again, we want the people that are on this call today to be able to walk away with some action items, some calls to keep moving in this direction. So what are some of the things that you can recommend for those watching today that would be a real tangible place to get started? And anyone, please feel free to jump in.
Well, I mentioned this before, but I think it's really great, especially for parents of students with disabilities, and that's your local parent training and information center, which is again funded by the federal government under the IDEA. I'm really fond of DREDF's Parent Training and Information Center. We have some really, really knowledgeable parents. All of the parents that are in our PTI center themselves have students with disabilities, have sometimes decades of experience advocating on behalf of their students. And I think really the most important thing for us as a community when we're creating a movement is that folks themselves have advocacy tools, not necessarily just for attorneys to be advocating on behalf of people, but for people to be able to advocate on behalf of themselves. And these folks are so great at training parents to be their own advocates, to understand what their rights are under the IDEA or any other law that they're trying to advocate under, and figuring out how to be a staunch advocate for your kids and how to use the law to your best interest. So every region in the United States has a parent training and information center. It's not just in Berkeley. You can look that up online and find your local one, and they are incredibly helpful.
I think to consider the possibilities of abolition in this moment and what it might look like in school, I recommend two books. One came out very recently, We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice by Mariam Kaba, who is a brilliant educator, curator, organizer, fighting against the prison industrial complex. And then the second is a collection of essays that came out last year called Beyond Survival, Stories and Strategies from the Transformative Justice Movement, edited by at least one woman named Jairus Dixon. The other editor escapes me right now. But both books, I'm halfway through the second title of Beyond Survival, but it's illustrating to me that, and this was something that I took from Representative Wu's comments, right? The existence of harm in our human relationships. It will always be there. We will inflict harm, we will endure it during our lives. But how we repair it, how we address it, how we hold each other accountable for it can lead to a different way of the world operating. And I think both of those texts really illustrate eloquently that possibility, and definitely in school. Similarly, so Mariam Kaba, the author of that first book, co-founded an organization called Project NIA, NIA, in Chicago that still operates, that's focused on ending youth incarceration. Yeah, I'll post the book titles. And they just came out with a resource called 1millionexperiments.com. I believe I'll double check that URL, but it's starting to illustrate so many ways that, especially over the past year, folks have not relied on policing, right? And folks have, through this intersectional analysis, through the various oppressive systems that bear down upon us, have really dug into community in this moment and made sure that folks are taken care of, are, to the extent we can make it happen, housed, fed, really sustained through this crisis of the pandemic. So I recommend that website, and I think you'll find a lot from it. And all of these resources, I think, will inform how you advocate at the Texas legislature. If we have folks from other states in your legislatures, how you advocate with the Biden administration, right? Things that we are doing, hopefully, to chip away at this behemoth security and prison infrastructure of the United States, right? So that we can get to something that actually serves our children.
As far as going to kind of what resources, and one of the biggest things that, especially as I joined the Disability Rights Texas team, was empowering individuals, right, to know their rights, know the law, know what they need to do. And we do a lot of work with the Partners Resource Network, trying to encourage that self-advocacy. But so much of what I found and what we found is that there's a lot of fear related to standing up for your rights or your students' rights, especially in those marginalized communities. I work with a lot of Spanish-speaking community. And so there's a lot of fear related to that. And so that empowerment to know your rights, know what resources are available. There's a wealth of information available through Partners Resource Network, through Disability Rights Texas, step by step of this is what is required. Also, I'm always a big advocate for, asking for additional information. Part of what we and Partners Resource Network do is we educate, right? So I've been asked to join panels like this, do a presentation, let's talk about this types of thing, where again, it's not the attorneys and, formal advocates advocating, but rather providing families with the resources so they can advocate. Because unfortunately, just like everything, there's a limit of people available to do it. So we want to grow that network of individuals, because a parent who is an advocate for their student becomes a support for the next parent who needs a support, who, hey, you know what, I'm having these same issues. Where can I go? What did you do? What is the law related to? Where can I find this information? So a lot of the resources that we try to provide on Disability Rights Texas are not only Disability Rights Texas resources, but for other networks, to become a network of information. That we work with Appleseed, we work with Partner Resource Network, we work with other organizations to make a collaborative resource where if I don't have the answer, I'm going to find a partner who can help in those types of situations. So I encourage, visiting those websites. Again, we have lists of what kind of resources are available, and we're always willing to answer whether we can offer representation or not. We always try to provide some type of advice to specific issues, and it doesn't hurt to call and ask.
No, and I appreciate that. When I was trying to research and reach out to speakers, I appreciate so much just the receptive nature that I received from all three of you. I could ask more questions, but I am not going to hog up the time. I'm sure that we probably have some questions or comments coming in from the chat or the Q&A. So I want to pass it to Scott and see if he's pulled any specific questions out there from our audience.
Excellent. And thank you. The chat has got a lot of great information. People have been sharing their stories with their personal stories about what's been happening with their children. We've had at least one bill number for the session that might interest people regarding some legislative efforts. And we've gotten a bunch of good questions in the Q&A. So I want to start with one from Jolene Sanders Foster, who asks, In addition to initiatives to prevent kids from being funneled to disciplinary alternative education programs or JJAEPs, can you talk about any recommendations or moves to reform how those programs are structured and or implemented?
Hey, Jolene. I've just met a lot of folks in the chat who I'm friends with and who I work with. So it's great to see everybody, and thank y'all for joining us. So in addition to the radical possibilities I've discussed over the past year, there have been a lot of conversations about the child welfare system, which it feels like JJAEPs are getting into a bit, right? We know that TJJD operates these JJAEPs across the state of Texas, but just the ability of the state to, one, separate families, to funnel young people through these really horrific carceral environments, right, that Representative Wu spoke about, and then lead them to, in their adulthood, many more possibilities that they will remain in the criminal legal system. So I think there have been some conversations really entertained more seriously than in previous sessions and previous times about abolishing those systems or restructuring them, right? And again, recognizing that JJAEPs are a form of exclusionary discipline that are really bearing down upon those historically underserved students. There's some really intriguing conversation happening in Dallas right now. Folks might see in the news that some of the trustees are convening with the Board of Trustees in Dallas ISD to talk about ending exclusionary discipline and what that might look like. And so I think that as those kinds of conversations are happening and that possibility is upon us, here's the time to say that, like, oh, we're including JJAEPs in these initiatives that must go, right? And that if you are going to end exclusionary discipline, we expect you to not carve out exceptions for young people who you feel that you can just continually railroad on this hamster wheel, but say, no, we're going to keep kids in class. We're going to build those relationships with them, and by all means necessary, keep them in their classrooms as they proceed through their K-12 education.
Excellent. And we've also got a question from Jaleesa Scott, who asks, what can we as advocates do if we suspect schools are calling police on children as a form of behavior management when those children have IDD or are in the evaluation process?
I think with this, a lot of it comes down to kind of what Representative Wu was saying. We need to get the data to find out how often this is happening. So what we at Disability Rights Texas is, of course, we're trying to always obtain information, but we do take on the individual cases. So if we find that in a school district, we're continuing to find the same type of situation, or whether it's specific schools that are doing it, we address it one case at a time through an MDR, through a complaint process, through a due process complaint, whatever the case may be, to assure that the rights of the students and families are being represented. So a lot of it comes to obtaining the information, obtaining the data available, which, as Jean was talking about earlier, we need to get that data to find out how often is this happening, why is it happening? And so much of it comes to, getting that information and then utilizing that information to kind of push back on these school districts for their failure to provide a free, appropriate public education, right? We hit it from kind of a different avenue to say, you're calling the police, you're having the police involvement for a behavior issue, which is a result of your failure to implement an appropriate behavior intervention plan, right? So we kind of hit it at different angles to get the data we need, but it all comes about getting that information and coming to that conclusion.
Excellent. And Andrew, I'm glad you brought up the Dallas effort that's that's kind of under discussion right now. And this next question kind of gets to that. So what portion of, with regard to restorative justice questions and just the overall topic, what portion of schools get it right? What portions seem to need more training? What is the key factor for it being performed correctly and getting principal buy-in?
I don't know if I've really seen any schools get it right. I've encountered districts where on paper they have the most robust restorative justice program. They have facilitators, they have apparently training, and then I see my clients' student records and exclusionary discipline all over the place. They're referred to restorative justice when a conflict happens. Restorative justice needs to be baked into the culture of a school. Students need to be able to lead discussions themselves. They need to be able to initiate restorative justice. School administrators need to be able to give students the freedom to do so. Teachers need to be trained on how to facilitate and how to train students to do it themselves. It can't just be one-off sessions, one-off circles. It has to be highly individualized. It has to be tailored to students' needs. Too often, schools have it on paper but don't actually fully incorporate it into the culture of the school. And if you have police at the same time that you have restorative justice, that's not restorative justice. You just can't coexist.
Thank you. Oh, yes.
I just can't agree enough with Malhar's sentiment, right? I mean, folks will really just lay out these really elaborate policy documents. We're a restorative justice district. We believe in it. We have coordinators. We're invested, right? But then so often the principals will say, it's not working. I still have to suspend students this academic year. So we're going to pull away the resources from it, right? And so that goes to your advocacy tip that I offer frequently, right? If it took so long for this to be built, then it's going to take at least as long to dismantle it, right, with restorative justice. And I will also say it's important that law enforcement loves to co-opt that language and talk about restorative justice. There, like Malhar said, there is no restorative justice with the police or the prison industrial complex, right? And so as you're kind of thinking about advocacy, I've really grown into that term transformative justice. You can kind of, use the terms as you see fit, right, in whatever setting. But yeah, be very cognizant of that co-optation. They love to do that, the police.
We've only got a few minutes left, and since we are in the middle of a legislative session, I did want to ask, so we heard about a few bills that Representative Wu is carrying. We've seen a bill or two listed in the chat. Is there any other legislation that y'all are looking at the Texas Capitol this session that people on this call should be paying attention to?
I don't know if the bill that Representative Wu was referring to concerning restorative justice is the same one I'm thinking of, but we've been behind the bill HB 62 that would create restorative justice coordinating councils in school districts across the state. We think that that could be a good step in the right direction in this session, especially where we're already seeing so many forces at play, right? Like with the energy grid failure and with the state's failure on the pandemic response, right? State government leadership wanting to, I think, deflect in that way. So, I'm hoping that that bill and others like it will move through the process in the second session, and no more bills that would harden schools more and add more policing and security.
I don't work in Texas, but on the federal level, there's a legislation called the Keep Students Safe Act, which would prohibit the use of restraints and seclusions on in entities that receive federal funding. That would be absolutely amazing. And just really quick, I'm sorry, to respond to the comment in the chat that restorative justice is great in theory. It's great in theory, and studies have shown it works. There are actual studies done when it's done correctly. The problem is schools don't do it correctly, but when it is done correctly, studies have shown it does work. So it's not just great in theory, and it's great for all students.
Excellent.
Just
And
to kindly quickly touch on one of the legislative that we're following right now is getting additional funding for the positive behavior intervention systems and kind of funneling funding and money into positive behavior on the education side. That's one of the ones we're looking at right now that we just recently got some more information about.
all right, thanks for that. And I think that's it for the questions that we have time for. So Lauda, turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. I've been kind of skimming the chat and seeing a lot of the input. You know, there's a lot of people that are, you know, aware of your work, or they're just learning, you know, they're learning more about it. And it's been a really personally a great experience to interact with all of you and have you on this panel today. Malhar, I'm glad you mentioned the federal aspect, because we wanted to touch on that also. Obviously, you know, politics are local, politics are state and federal, and so it all trickles down. There's so much important work that needs to continue to be done, but you know, personally, I'm just very thankful that we have people like y'all out there doing this work. And again, I want to thank everybody so much for joining us for this conversation today. If we didn't get a chance to get to your questions, I'm sure we'll try to save them and see what we can get to. But really that concludes what we have for y'all today in this presentation. I hope that you kind of go away with some enlightenment on the school to prison pipeline and what an immense issue it is, and all the work that needs to still be done to protect students, all students, and students with disabilities and those of color. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
What an honor. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone. Goodbye.